welcome to another episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish. I'm your host, Grant Pemberton, and on today's episode, we have another returning special guest. So, Ken, why don't you give us the introduction of today's special guest?
Yeah, today's guest is a returning guest, Elizabeth Woning. She was with us last year. She's a friend of mine that I met through the ministry of Bethel Church. I think we were actually introduced or connected by Bill Johnson, and she and I and a mutual colleague, Ken Williams, whenever I'm in Reading, or nearly whenever, I don't want to say every single time, but nearly every time I'm in Reading, I get together with the two of them, and we have fascinating conversations that are highly engaging intellectually about what's going on in the world of the gay rights movement. Elizabeth is involved with Ken in the Changed movement is the name of it, and she's recently undergone some changes of her own in terms of the way she's carrying out the ministry the Lord's given to her. So that's going to be kind of where we begin the podcast today. And Elizabeth, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, it's a privilege. Always love talking to you, Ken.
Well, it's always a pleasure for me too. So in fact, we've just been having a, what do you want to call it? A pregame warm-up, I think is what Vince Scully used to call it, before the podcast, just chatting back and forth. But now we're at it in earnest. And so, Elizabeth, why don't you bring us up to speed on some of the shift in focus for your ministry? You've moved somewhat away from pastoral care and pastoral ministry and more towards legislative action.
Well, actually, that's a complex question, to tell the truth. So I'm a pastor on staff at Bethel Church. And so I do continue kind of in the pastoral ministry role to some degree, particularly with the ministry school here. And my education and training is in theology. In fact, I'm working on a doctorate in theology right now. And so I still kind of keep a handhold in the ministry sphere, at least insofar as biblical interpretation and then theological interpretation are involved. But then, so when Changed was formed, which I know we've probably talked about that many times online, but so our organization Changed was formed in 2018. We had formed a ministry called Equipped to Love here at Bethel just about 18 months prior to a legislative event here in California that basically would have meant, it would have really caused problems for us in our ministry. So the legislation that was proposed essentially was a consumer fraud bill that said something along the lines of, since we know sexual orientation can't change, any suggestion that it can or that it should be made illegal. It should be considered fraud in the state of California. And so that meant that, for example, Ken, just a couple of years ago, published his first memoir, Ken Williams did.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't have been able to sell that in the state of California because it talks about his life and the process that he went through with the Lord kind of leaving LGBT. And so recognizing that this legislation was a major problem, we ended up kind of showing up at the Capitol and got roped in, I would say, whisked up, somehow swept up into speaking against that legislation. And we, between the two of us, I think we spoke in most of the major legislative hearings against the bill. And at one point, it was pretty clear that no one believed that people left LGBT. And so we decided we would publish a book of testimonies. In fact, I think I've got a copy here. So that we called it Changed to be provocative. We were trying to be provocative because that was the very issue that we were all there about. And so it just has really beautiful spreads, a 500-word testimony with some photos. And we printed that really quick and took it back to the Capitol with us next time we were there with a group of friends, and passed it out to senators and assembly members. And then we did a rally on the Capitol steps, and that rally with our friends was live streamed. And out of that live stream, we started hearing from people across the world who had similar backgrounds as us.
Yeah.
And so that was the inception of Change Movement. It really is a little bit of a grassroots network, worldwide network of men and women who have left LGBT to follow Christ. Since we were birthed, if you will, in this public policy space, we've always stayed there to some degree. So on the one hand, Ken leads the pastoral care side, which really is mostly equipping. Like, one of our chief values is that the church itself is the main agent of healing and wholeness. And so even Ken doesn't do a lot of one-on-one counseling or consulting. Mainly, we do equipping. We make sure that the body of Christ can receive people from LGBTQ culture and identities to follow the Lord wholeheartedly. But then we've continued, say, testifying in key witness hearings across the US, particularly on the issue of conversion therapy bans. But also, there are several members of our network who detransitioned. So also speaking to all of the gender ideology issues, the legislation around that. So that's kind of
position. Just to be clear, I think I know what you mean, but I want to be sure our listeners know what you mean. You mean people who identified as transgender, they had changed their sex, and now they're changing back, correct?
That's correct.
And
That's
that's
correct.
also believed not to be possible in the
It
prevailing
is, yeah. It is, and there's a lot to that experience, and really the whole issue of gender identity and gender ideology is almost a separate matter from LGB. But so I spearhead kind of the culture and theology side of our organization, and Ken stays focused on church equipping and caring for the individuals who are part of our movement.
Interesting. So you've given us a flavor or a taste of how this all got teed up and I remember when that bill was before the California legislature. And I mean, among people who are of a Christian persuasion, and I think this is primarily Christians, because non-Christians don't have any, they either don't care whether you're gay or straight, or they figure you are what you are. Whereas Christians have a theological and an ethical imperative, which is eroding in some places, unfortunately, but there's a biblical basis for our point of view. And so this really leads to a direct conflict of the freedom of religion, First Amendment rights, and the right to practice your religion freely, which, I mean, our scriptures are quite clear, although people are trying to reinterpret them and rewrite them, but they're quite clear about how God views all of these range of behaviors that are outside of what's come to be known as heteronormativity, in a very pejorative way, I might add.
Yeah.
So we've got, if people don't have a biblical foundation, whether because they're secularized, they're a-religious, maybe they're from a different religious tradition, say Buddhism or Hinduism, where this is not as much of a thing, they don't really have much basis for resisting this or pushing back. And that seems to be where the culture has, I'll say, devolved to. And with that being the case, and we can't even really count on much support from the Jewish community, because in general, Jews don't really read the scriptures in the sort of devotional, ethical, imperative way that Christians tend to do. I'm not saying they never do it, because there are some who do, and I want to be fair to them. But I'd say if you think of more liberal, Reform type Jews, even many conservative Jews, not so much the Orthodox and the Hasidic, but the liberal, Reformed, the conservative Jews that are somewhere in the middle between the Orthodox and the Reformed, many of them don't really think of these things as having much binding force at all. They view their scriptures in most cases as sort of guiding how do we observe Passover or how do we observe Yom Kippur. And this is very much tied to a cultural tradition, but not really a theological or an ethical one. I think that's a fair characterization for the majority of Jews. Again, not all. So here we are as Christians. We're standing alone against the tide. Tell me about what other activities you've engaged in to try and stem the tide, or at least speak out and be a voice in the wilderness.
Well, so as I mentioned before, we've done a lot at addressing conversion therapy bans, and honestly, I would say that is probably the number one space that I've focused on internationally, because so a conversion therapy ban is touted as a protective measure for individuals who identify as LGBTQ, because it's perceived as not only impossible but harmful to encourage a person to question their sexuality, question the roots of their perceived sexual orientation, because sexual orientation is actually not scientific. And so, I mean, the sense of what I feel sexually and how I want to be sexually gratified, most of popular culture, at least secular culture, believes that however you feel should be completely affirmed, because that's the route to true happiness. And so, you know, conversion therapy bans are being widely accepted as an important measure to protect people who are questioning their sexuality. The problem with that, and focusing on harms, and mostly these days focusing on, you know, how painful it is to go through the self-discovery, the questioning process of why you have the feelings, or what the formation of the feelings is all about. However, most people think of shock therapies and conversion therapy camps and those kinds of things when the phrase is evoked, but none of that is actually happening very widely, even though like every day there's probably an article about conversion therapy and people having gone through it. There are actually fewer than a dozen actual court cases that focus on conversion therapy, and probably less than 50% of those have to do with ethical grievances or actual abuses. And so actually the furor over the need for these bans is really interesting. But what it's effectively doing, and this is why I have a problem with it, is it's limiting free speech in a confidential setting. So it means if a conversion therapy ban is in place, then it means that if I go to a licensed therapist, the state can control what we talk about.
Absolutely.
And so that's what a conversion therapy ban does, essentially. It gives the government that control. And so irregardless of the topic, but especially if the topic is LGBT, now the government can get involved. And that means for people like me, state-sanctioned or government-mandated sexual identity. So if I identify as gay and I want to understand why, or I'm questioning my sexuality and I want to understand why, and I want to grapple with whether I should or need to identify as LGBT, then the government would say through one of these bans that if that's the case and you're meeting a counselor, you only have one choice, and that's to embrace gay identity. And so it's a significant problem that most pastors, most Christians are not recognizing, but worldwide what it means is that those kinds of bans are being introduced at a very great cost to religious freedom. So what, you know, in Canada and Australia right now, a private living room conversation can give you jail time if you, through even a moment of prayer, encourage a person to desist from LGBT identities, and that individual takes that wrongly. And so it's very invasive, and I mean, it's probably the biggest anti-Christian movement worldwide that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, we had someone on the podcast a little while back named Torben Sondergaard. He's a I guess you would call him a dissident, uh, who's Danish. He has been in hot water with his own government for practicing healing, deliverance, um, preaching that people can leave the gay lifestyle. And in fact, that the gay lifestyle is not acceptable to God. This is a form of sin you need to turn from. And so he came to the United States, and the uh, Customs and Border Protection Agency, which is kind of the overarching entity that also controls INS, they arrested him and they held him in prison here in the U.S. for over a year. And he was telling us his story, and eventually he was released through the I'm using the word in a secular sense, but the intercession of some civil rights groups that are, advocates for conservative causes and for Christian dissidents in other lands and so forth. Um, and so he's free now, but he's not back in Denmark. He's living in Mexico, kind of a man in exile, because of the trend that this is taking. And one of the things I think is worth pointing out here that many people don't connect the dots, but a lot of times, if you listen to popular Christian talk in the blogosphere, which could include talk radio, but you tend to see more of it online. A lot of Christians of a conservative bent are throwing out the association or the analogy of the gay rights movement and Marxism. And they're saying they're the same thing. I don't think they intended to be the same thing, particularly when you know that Vladimir Putin doesn't allow homosexuality to be openly advocated or practiced in Russia. So there's an immediate kind of, wait a minute, what's going on with that statement? But what's underneath it is the idea of big government being able to suppress speech. And all we have to do is think back to the dark days before the Berlin Wall came down. And for whatever reason, it really stands out in my mind, the governments of Erich Honecker, who was the leader of East Germany, what was East Germany. Now Germany's been reunified and there is no more East Germany. But anyway, Erich Honecker was the leader of partitioned Eastern Germany, as well as the leaders of Romania and Albania. Those three nations in particular stand out in my mind because they did regulate very much the private conversations that went on in homes. Oftentimes homes were bugged or wiretapped. People were encouraged to rat out their children or parents or grandparents if they were saying things that were contrary to what the state espoused. And this trend that you pointed out is, I would say, very uncomfortably similar to that which was in place under those regimes.
That's correct. That's what's so interesting about the modern day LGBTQ activist movement, which I mean, a close look at activist culture in the United States has ties to Marxist thought. Now, Marxism is mostly, not entirely, but mostly an economic theory. But the philosophies and the philosophers connected to Marx were certainly, there's a whole, like James Lindsay is a good name that I like to throw out, focusing on Marxism in the United States right now. So he would say that Marxism is like a genus. And so then underneath Marxism, you have several species. And so everything like Michel Foucault or Derrida or Nietzsche or Rousseau, any of these names, the philosophies connected to them have captivated American academics for the last 100 plus years. And the activist movements of the 60s are born very closely connected to the Marxist movements. And I think when people think of activism in the United States, they certainly don't think of Marxism. And then most millennials and younger don't shudder like we do.
Right.
there is a very strong collectivist attraction among millennials and younger right now that is closely correlated to Marxism. And within that is this kind of equality, equity, diversity, inclusivity notion, which at a very superficial level is fantastic. Like, we do want diversity, we do want inclusion, we want biblical equity, but the underlying forces, which are essentially social construction, we don't want, because they are totalitarian in nature. They're authoritative. They don't allow for the contest of ideas in the free market, public dialogue. They completely cut off any possibility of public dialogue, and that totalitarian element is very obvious in the LGBT discussion in public policy matters, where it's now becoming illegal across the world to reject LGBT identities for yourself or for your family. And that is highly politicized. It's no longer simply a matter of embracing someone who has a minority sexual experience. It's about the politics involved, because there's legislation and other things involved around it. And that makes the LGBT issue very different than many other matters across the world that Christianity is facing.
Well, and to put a very fine point on it, you and I are both residents of California. And in this state, if a parent has a child who identifies as anything other than straight and cisgendered, for those who don't know, the term cisgendered means you identify with what your genitals tell you you are. It's usually expressed differently, but that's the simplest and clearest way to say it.
Yeah.
So if your child identifies as anything other than straight and cisgendered, then if you even question it, if the child should alert whether the school authorities who are under mandatory reporting, or if they themselves should go to the Child Protective Services bodies, the authorities can show up at your house literally within a matter of a couple of hours and take the child out of your home. They will not disclose where the child has gone, and the child is placed into protective custody. It's as though you are a sexual abuser or a violent abuser, and they are protecting the child. And it might literally be the last time you see your child, maybe ever, but for sure for months, as all of the court process and the lawsuits and everything else unwind. And because this now has the force of law here in California, and there are comparable codes in place, particularly in some of the states in Australia, and it's on its way to becoming universal there. And we could name other nations as well, but I have a lot of familiarity with Australia. Because it has the force of law, really you're fighting an uphill battle to try to get your child back. You probably won't succeed at that. And the only time that you might ever have any sort of a rapprochement would be when they reach 18, if they choose to circle back around to you. To me, that is a terrifying prospect, and it is very analogous to what we used to see in communist nations, when the authorities would take children out of homes and take them from their parents if the parents were deemed to be, in quotes, enemies of the state.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and so I don't think that there's actually an official and accepted Marxist terminology for what we're watching happening right now. A lot of people will say cultural Marxism or neo-Marxism, but none of those terms really have held, and all of them have different meanings depending on who's speaking about them. But this separation of children from parents is another element that we've seen in communist culture, and that's definitely happening in California now. The scenario you're talking about, I think, is still thankfully quite rare. Last year, the governor vetoed a bill. So that means that it went through both houses of the California Assembly and Senate. The governor vetoed a bill that would have required the custody courts to favor the affirming parent in a custody case. But still it remains that a child in California is at the age of minority at age 12 for mental health care. So if they go to, say, their school counselor and express the desire to socially transition, and they express that they are struggling with fear of their parents and fear that their parents will not affirm, then the school counselor is given priority over the parents in decision making, and that child can then opt into care outside of the home, mental health care. And so, I mean, the trajectory on this particular issue, see, before we started the conversation or the recording, we were talking about how the nature of LGBTQ is completely changing, or it's morphing into something. And this phenomenon around gender identity is completely a shift from the Stonewall movement. So we're experiencing a really dramatic cultural change, and LGBTQ and its antiquated non-discrimination language of born that way, et cetera, which has been scientifically disproved, is the blunt force tool, legal mechanism that's pushing this cultural change forward. And so, as someone who is identified as lesbian and someone who walks with individuals who are trying to follow a Christian sexual ethic with this life experience, that scenario is one thing. But what's being taught in schools, and pressed upon young children, and what is happening to the family, the traditional family structure as a result in the United States, is an entirely different one. And so it's, I think, so important for Christians to wake up to this dramatic shift that's happening and recognize that LGBT identities are not what they used to be. Like Gallup's poll this past year about LGBT identity, how many people in the United States are identifying, reflect a 115% change over the last 10 years in the number of people identifying, and are so bold to say that 29% of Gen Z identify as non-heterosexual LGBTQ. And so that unless there was a really incredible change in human biology over the last 20 years, which if you're an evolutionary biologist would be impossible. What we're seeing right now is a cultural shift, a cultural change to adopting these identities, mainly because of their cultural value, in my opinion.
Right. So let me unpack what I think I heard you say. You're using good academic language, reflecting your training and the fact that you spend a lot of time in front of legislators, and you have to be very, very particular about how you word it. But what you just said is human biology doesn't change that quickly. And just for reference, by the way, there have been numerous studies done at different times on Western societies, American and more. And the long-term number for any form of LGBTQIA anything, even just a one-off, all of that thrown together, tends to run between 2.7 and 2.9% of the overall population. And that includes people who just had a one-time experience. They wake up the next morning and they're like, this never happened. We're not going to talk about what we did last night, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. So that would even include those people. So it's historically been about a 33-to-1 ratio of straight to any form of LGBTQIA at any time at all, not even long-term committed. And what you just said was that in Gen Z, about a third of them are identifying as non-heterosexual, which would be any form of LGBTQIA. So that represents something in the range of a tenfold increase per capita. And since population biology won't explain that rapid of a change, unless maybe something's come into the air and the water, I don't know.
It's all the plastic water bottles.
It's all the plastic water bottles. Given that, and I'm just trying to lay it out so that anyone who's listening to this, maybe driving down the road, can can catch it and think through it. Given that, the only remaining explanation is that we are programming, or if you want to say it, brainwashing. But anyway, we are creating an ideology and a cultural environment whereby this is now viewed as normative and acceptable. And consequently, many of our youth who are in their learning years, they're, if you want to say it, pliable. They are embracing what they're being told in the schools or through the media or on TikTok or wherever they're getting their information. And they are conforming to that, or at least self-identifying with it and beginning to explore it. And so we are creating a problem in our society by what we are doing. And I'll just add this, you didn't say this, this is me tagging it on. But this is why in the Old Testament, many of the scriptures that are dealing with the governance of a nation and the creation of a culture, specifically speak into why this is not permitted in ancient Israeli society. Because God knows where these things will go when they are allowed to propagate or are indeed fostered and blessed, it's sanctioned in the proper use of the word, by the authorities.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the two things I want to comment on there. So what I think we're observing is the desire to belong and be accepted, and the extreme pressure to be accepted through LGBTQ culture is what we're watching among children, in my opinion. Because being an outlier, like being a Christian, a white Christian male in particular, in school right now is the worst possible, I think, identity that you could have. But so then a lot of young people are identifying as non-binary, and that's reflective of what I'm calling gender ideology, which honestly is different than LGBT in a way. So the gender ideology, I would say, is more rooted in sexual freedom or sexual fluidity, this belief that you can create your own identity and that there should be no boundaries on your sexual behavior or on your gender, and that gender is a socially derived idea.
Right.
You know, just like stereotypes are socially derived, your sense of masculinity is socially defined. All of that is too complex probably for us to talk about. I'll try to reel it back in, Ken, so that I'm writing a paper at the same time and doing podcast with you. But the effects are now that LGBT, so LGBT as a political entity has always been kind of a rough organization. Like, I think they've joined together to have political power, but it's not like it's not like a cohesive unit, not all the time. But particularly between LGB and T, or LGB and TQ perhaps. So on the LGB side, you have this idea that you're a victim of your body, basically. Like, you can't control the desires that you have, therefore you must give yourself to those desires for satisfaction and well-being. On the T side, it's exactly the opposite. So the perspective is, I'm not my body. I have complete authority over my body. So I will change my body to align with my emotional or my psychological well-being. Both of them are dissociative, but they have very different perspectives, different worldviews. And so now we have the rise of Q, which has often been questioning. Like, among Changed, the Q kind of represents questioning. The majority of our movement is comprised of people who are questioning or have questioned. But now queer is more of a non-binary identity. Queer could be anything. It could be male today, female tomorrow, and they don't want to identify as one of the letters. And, you know, the ultimate trajectory to that is, you know, people like James Marsh, who would have all of their masculine, like full mustache or whatever, and then wear a dress or whatever. So it's a complete creative expression of self that is neither male nor female or both. And I would say that's the trajectory towards transhumanism. And so queer has the ability, since it doesn't agree with the sex binary, it has the ability to completely dissolve or discredit all of LGB, even LGBT that's based on the sex binary. So the rise of the queer movement that we're watching right now could dissolve the whole LGBT movement as we've known it. So we're in the midst of a really dramatic cultural shift.
Now, on that point of those who identify as queer, and I know for those who don't, who aren't of that persuasion, this word can be a pretty loaded term. It can carry some of the same pejorative.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when I was a part of the gay community, we used it as a pejorative, and we blessed it for ourselves because it was pejorative.
Right.
But now that the same transgressive kind of attitude that we see just manifest generally, particularly is manifest with gender ideology and gender queer.
Right. So with that caveat, because I'm not using the term to assault anyone or to use verbal violence or to demean or debase anyone. I'm simply using it because it's a term that is in use in these conversations, and not just yours and mine. I mean, wider academic circles, legislative circles, and so on. So we've got this thing known as the LGBTQIA plus movement. So it's gotten bigger, and people kind of jokingly say the alphabet. But what are the numbers in terms of people who identify as queer as we've just defined it?
Boy, I don't know if I could tell you that. Yeah, I don't have any statistics on that. Although I can say that the majority of individuals who identify as LGBTQIA identify as bisexual. So statistics are upwards of 65, sometimes 75% of the whole movement is bisexual. And so within the whole movement, there's this strong sentiment of sexual fluidity. And so all building to the queer movement that we're watching unfold right now. And so within that, coming back to, if you're a Christian and you're questioning your sexuality, the majority of us who are in that space, even if we have identified as gay or lesbian, have had a mainly or mostly bisexual experience. Statistically, the number of people in the gay community who have only experienced same-sex sexual experience is actually very, very low. The majority have or could testify to having had opposite sex attractions, even if they prioritize, or the majority of the time, they are tending towards same-sex sexual feelings. So, within that, I think, I'm talking to you, and obviously I'm talking to you in really clinical terms, but when it comes down to the individual who's stuck in the middle of all this, your life experience is, I have these attractions. I can't stop myself from having these attractions. It's very hard to self-discipline yourself away from them. You kind of find yourself with these feelings. And so the question I have now is, should you come out? Should you come out as gay or lesbian? Because coming out as gay or lesbian ushers you into this culture, and this culture is becoming this highly politicized, pseudo-Marxist expression of gender that has anti-democratic, or at least anti-Republican, and I don't mean like Democrat and Republican, I mean like more totalitarian or collectivist ideals. Should you become a part of that? And in my opinion, there are great risks to that.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the time to at least acknowledge that if I have same-sex sexual feelings, I do not want to be a part of that cultural expression.
Right. So one of the other statistics that I carry around in my mind, I attended a lecture after I got out of business school at UCLA, where I went to business school. But the lecture wasn't sponsored by the business school, just to be clear. It was just a lecture. I was an alumnus, so I went. And so they were giving some statistics that were coming out of the research they were doing on all this. And, this is a little while back, and things have moved on, but the numbers haven't really changed. I've seen a few updated studies, and it's amazing how seldom these statistics are really put in front of the public in any of the main organs of media, or for that matter, even when things are being debated in the Senate or the Assembly, or if it's at the federal level, the Senate and the House of Representatives. But I said earlier in this conversation that it's something like 2.7 to 2.9% of all people have ever had any form at any time, short-lived or long-term, of an LGBTQIA experience. Well, the number for transgenderism works out at 0.1% of the population. So of the say it's 2.9, put it at the high end. That means knock off the transgenders, then you got 2.8 left of all the rest of it. And I think the queer and intersectional kind of groupings, they're just slightly ahead of the transgender, so it's probably in the 0.2 to 0.3 range. Now, again, there's a whole sociological shift going on that you've been talking about, so this could be rising in the younger generations, but certainly in the 20 plus age group, things are still pretty stable, right at the numbers I've just thrown out. And I don't think most people know this. And so what this really means is a very small but quite organized and vocal minority is driving the entire agenda of family legislation and more.
Yeah, I would say it's not just the minority, though, that's driving the change. It is allies of the minority.
Absolutely.
It's our friends like Nancy Pelosi and others, Joe Biden, who are impressed with the concerns of the LGBTQ community, which, that life experience is a challenge. And there are a lot of so there's a lot of diversity in the LGBTQ community, diversity of experience. But one of the universals is how sensitive they are, how much they tend towards depressive behaviors, how much they tend towards addictive behaviors. And social stigma theory, the theory that it's culture that causes a lack of well-being, is really only one of many theories trying to understand the poor mental health statistics within the LGBT community. It's actually the least likely, because America is more accepting than it's ever been. And Europe, for example, is highly accepting and has been for years, yet the mental health statistics are really about the same. They don't continue to improve. And so, within that, I guess what I want to say is that this idea, this movement, this cultural shift is happening around a very small minority and around an unusual experience of life, but the cultural changes are enormous in comparison to that specific need. And so it's more our cultural elites who may or may not identify as gay that are driving the cultural shift. And this is where it's so important to understand what is happening. It's not about LGBT. It's about the change of government structure, the way big government controls society, and what ideas and what speech we may have in the public arena that is being fought for. And LGBT is being used by the cultural elites, in my opinion, or by a certain segment of culture to make a huge political change in the United States.
Very well put. I can't think of anything I want to add or clarify to what you just said.
I mean, where we are seeing it, for example, in China or seeing it in Russia, or you started out by saying, well, it can't be purely Marxist because like Russia doesn't endorse it. The reason why Russia and China don't endorse it is because they see its potential for government upheaval and destabilization. They're watching the West, America in particular, be destabilized by these dialogue, this point of contention. And for example, China, there's no religious issue in China for restricting LGBT, but in the last year, there have been more restrictions, like they are pulling back on freedom for LGBTQ in China because they're watching this movement unfold in the United States, the destabilization that it's causing in the United States.
Yeah. Very, very, very well put. It's one of the things I love about talking to you. You're on the issues and you're very articulate as you describe them. All right. Well, we're about out of time on this conversation, and we can always talk more and more. But let me just ask you, as someone who's come out of that world and who is now living a heterosexual lifestyle, if you were going to give maybe 2 or 3 points of advice to those who currently identify either as having same-sex attraction or any version of LGBTQIA, what would you say to help them?
Well, I would say, first of all, that following Jesus is the route to the need that you have for fulfillment, that the love of Jesus is the thing that you most desire. And now I'm not saying that LGBTQ is mutually exclusive of Christian faith, but I am saying that LGBTQ can be a limitation in your discipleship journey with the Lord. And that once you cross the threshold of saying, I want to be a disciple of Jesus, then it's imperative that you understand the biblical anthropology and the order of God's creation and seek to embrace it and obey it. And the Lord demands our obedience, and our obedience to the way of the Lord is really the best way for us to show love for the Lord. So often the reason why I say all that, the very first cutoff point for someone who identifies as LGBTQ is God would not receive me, or I could not become a Christian. And so I want to just say that God will receive you and is always welcoming. But then the journey towards the Lord involves better understanding his nature and then seeking to obey scripture. And then within that, that's the journey of self-discovery. So when the closer you get to the Lord and seeing the face of the Lord, you also actually start to see yourself more clearly. And the Lord holds the keys to our identity. Our lives are so complex, and it's so challenging to understand how to be, who to be, what we want to be in our culture today, irregardless of LGBTQ identities. And it's so liberating to say the Lord has created me and has a purpose and a plan. He has meaning for my life that transcends anything and could potentially be more satisfying and fulfilling than anything I could ever dream up for myself. That would be the first thing that I would say. But then once you enter into relationship with the Lord, don't stop there. Like, allow the Lord to scrutinize your heart. Allow the Lord, learn how to pray and hear from the Lord so that he can give you the absolute truth about your life, not whether you're gay or straight, but what's behind all the feelings. Because any of us who have moved on from LGBTQ identity and not only let go of that embrace, but embraced our manhood or womanhood, have gone down this self-discovery journey of what are the roots behind these feelings, and why do I have them? And many of those, there are answers that the Lord has to those questions. And once you discover that, it's so liberating, irregardless of what it does to your sexual feelings themselves. It's just so liberating to know the truth about your life and the formative events of your life. And I mean, many in the church don't recognize the value of that for someone who identifies as LGBTQ. Like, just stopping with the gay narrative and saying, I was born that way, comes with a whole host of problems, including not remedying behaviors and feelings that among the heteronormative crowd would never be accepted. But because we're gay, are pressured, we're pressured to protect them. Things like unhealthy emotional relationships and other things. And so it's so important to replace that narrative of born that way with understanding of the formative events of your life, so that you realize that this is not an innate and a determinative aspect of being.
Yeah.
Just embracing being a son or daughter of God is the crown.
Right. Yeah. And I like the way you said a son or daughter, because again, we're back to God created mankind, male and female. So for women, you're daughters of God. For men, you're sons of God. But we're all children of God.
That's right.
Yeah. All right. Well, some of our listeners may remember that we said last year that this year, 2024, we were going to try and do a conference. We had real facility problems getting that off the ground, but we are looking ahead and trying to plan something for 2025. So for those of you that have enjoyed this conversation with Elizabeth, you'll want to attend that conference next year. She will be one of the speakers, as will I, and we'll be able to talk even more in depth than we have already done on this podcast. But Elizabeth, thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate
it's been fun. Thanks, Ken. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Grant, you got anything you want to add or ask?
Yeah, Elizabeth, where can people find more information about you and what you're doing?
Oh, thank you for reminding me. So you can find the Changed Movement at changedmovement.com, all one word, and that's changed past tense. And you can find me and Ken and our resources on that website. We've just published or just released a new video curriculum that we're hoping churches will get a hold of, because for obvious reasons, but because it's our newest product. And then you can also read my blog, if you'd like, at elizabethwanning.com. I try to publish there at least quarterly. More often than not, it's bi-monthly. And so, yeah.
I just throw in a gratuitous endorsement too. From time to time, Elizabeth will send me over her latest blog postings, and they are deep and rich, well thought through, compassionate, articulate, and they're everything that she is. And so you want to follow this blog.
Many of the things that you and I have just talked about have been published in an essay that I published on my website called LGBTQ and the Political Divide. And so that could be a good starting point if this has piqued anyone's interest.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, do you want to close this in prayer, Elizabeth, before we go?
Yeah, I'd love that. Thanks. Father, we ask that you would bless America. And Lord, for the LGBTQ community and all those who are caught up in it, Lord, we lift them up to you, and we ask that you would encounter them with your love, that you would draw all of America to yourself. And Lord, I pray that you would raise this a countercultural movement that truly loves, that truly embraces equity, that truly embraces the beautiful diversity of American culture and creates this inclusivity that we're all so hungry for, but yet have not had the wisdom of God to create in America. And so, Lord, visit us with revival and bring your justice to America. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you so much for taking time and talking. This has been amazing. And thank you all for listening. We'll be back here next week with another episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish.
Join us at the upcoming Ignition Conference in Nashville, Tennessee, October 3rd through the 5th. At the conference, Ken will be joined by Jack Deere, Cindy Jacobs, Chris Reed, Stacy Campbell, Putty Putman, Jeremy Nelson, and others as they explore how to build a sustainable move of God. Registration is now open for the conference. and early bird pricing ends on Sunday, June 30th. If you're interested in attending, you can click on the link below in the description of this podcast and register today.